Thank you for being back to the first afternoon session. You had the chance to have a lot of bilateral consultations, discussions, negotiations. So we have a perspective from the periphery, where the periphery is in part Euro periphery and in part political periphery, so to say, the UK, and EU periphery from the other side of Europe, namely East. So Britain from the West, Poland, Jan Toporowski from the East, and I'm looking forward to the fresh wind that will blow through this room right now. You have the floor, Professor Macedo.
Well, thank you, Chairman. As far as fresh air is concerned, I will rather use maritime analogies, which, coming from a Portuguese, will not be a surprise to any of you. I will try, in this very limited time, to present to you the nature of Portugal's adjustment, but to do it with an analogy that I hope also reflects the broader issue of the Eurozone to be saved in the title of our conference. And for that, I am using a traditional, very, very common Portuguese expression, morrer na praia, to die on the beach. This comes from many cases of shipwrecks, and the swimmer gets out of the ship, swims, but reaches the beach, reaches the shore. Yes, I like it. Please, Linda? Yeah, I need that. Thanks. Yeah, that's the full presentation. I needed it for comfort. And he's swimming, and he's trying to get to shore. And he does get to shore, but he dies of exhaustion. And so this is an issue that, of course, can happen either because he dies of exhaustion or because he thinks it's a beach, but it's in fact not a beach because the Eurozone has not been saved. So it is broad enough for our purposes. Since I have really a lot of slides, and some of them a little bit too analytical, perhaps, for quick presentation, let me give you the basic points. My point is that the Eurozone crisis is first and foremost a balance of payments crisis. There are all sorts of other points, but they are second order relative to what is the essential constraint in any open economy. You gotta pay your debts. So that's the basic point. It's a balance of payments crisis, rather than a sovereign debt crisis or a banking crisis, even though all of that is there as well, but it's essentially a balance of payments crisis. And this is why comparing it to other balance of payments crises, the Latin American crisis, starting with Mexico in the 80s, which led to a lost decade, 10 years of no growth, or instead the East Asian crisis in the 90s, including Russia, which led to very severe recessions, but then a very quick turnaround, which was called sometimes the Phoenix recovery. That's an exercise that must be done. And it must be done because this is much more than about the transatlantic partnership. This is about the world as we see it, where financial markets are something you have to take for granted, even in the US of A, even in the City of London, even in mighty Germany. This was not the case in the 30s, where the two sides of the Atlantic completely dominated the financial scene. And this is a point of departure from which I will extract some consequences to understand the case of Portugal. Let me just give you one additional point which I will elaborate upon. Portugal was a founding member of the Euro, but it did not grow for the entire first decade of the Euro, where all of the European Commission commentariat would tell you that the euro was a big success, everything was fine, everything was great. Portugal at that time was already not growing. Why was that? Because it could not manage to introduce sufficient competitiveness to open its economy. The economy of Portugal, measured by the usual trade percentages that were used, for example, this morning in Ando's presentation, the trade balance or the current account balance was more close than Germany, when it is a very small economy. During this adjustment, the percentage of trade in GDP jumped from 28 to 40%. And the economy is opening big time, of course, during recession, as we all know. But some things that should have been done when the times were good, some reforms that should have been carried out when the times were good, are now being carried out under duress, but they are, in a certain way, working the balance of payments problem. And so if you take the position that it's a balance of payments problem, you get the kind of answer that I will put to you. Now, the two assumptions, I already mentioned one. The Eurozone is embedded in the European Union, a very strange relationship, and this is what has to do with our traditional ally, Britain. I'm not sure Stuart will address this point because he's not like any other Briton. I mean, he's more continental in some respect. But this is a point that for a country like Portugal is very important, that the Atlantic dimension there is often forgotten. And then, of course, there is the global South, the idea that Lula expressed wonderfully when Gordon Brown visited him in early 2009 and asked him about the crisis. And he said, no, this is a blue-eyed crisis. We have nothing to do with that. He may not have been right, but this idea that the crisis is global is quite key. Now, the other point that comes from seeing this as a balance of payments crisis is that the adjusting country is the country as a whole, all of its residents. The government, the people, but also the courts. And in this regard, the situation of Portugal has been determined to a very large extent by the existence of a constitutional court that, unlike the constitutional court in Germany, which is constantly thinking whether the government is not ceding sovereignty to Brussels, and there is fear that this may happen, in this case, it's perhaps a little difficult, but in this case, what they are trying to preserve is the constitution that was voted in 1976, led to a generalized nationalization of the economy and to the construction of a classless society. I mean, this is still in the prelude of the Constitution, and that's what the Constitutional Court sees itself as doing. So in a certain way, you have over 80% of the parliament, the people who were elected, that have signed the Memorandum of Understanding. By the way, extremely flawed Memorandum of Understanding, everybody agrees, but that's what we signed up to. Over 80% of the parliament has signed the document that the constitutional judges think is not as relevant as the constitution of the middle 70s. I mean, this is the problem, and this is what I will try to very quickly motivate, with one terminal condition in mind, and that's the exit from the program. The exit from the program, which is due in June 2014, will imply that the state will be capable of financing itself without help, just like the other countries under bailout. The Ireland will come out in mid-December, and this is now the great discussion: is what kind of insurance do we need to complete this adjustment, this assisted adjustment? And of course, the program of outright monetary transactions, which has already been mentioned several times this morning, looms large, but it's never been used. I mean, so there is a certain anxiety in Portugal about the way out, including, as I said before, the anxiety about the Constitutional Court, these 13 not wise men, because there are women, perhaps also for some other reasons, because they are really clinging to a legalistic interpretation of the Constitution, very much against what the US experience would suggest, and there are some references in the paper. So in other words, it could well be the case that the Eurozone will be saved. I personally believe that it will, through the muddling through that we have grown accustomed to. But is it clear that Portugal will be saved? Well, no. We might die on the beach. So that's what we have in store, just a few factoids. It's divided in 3 parts. The ocean, exchange rate volatility and current account imbalances. That's the key. I mean, we are talking about balance of payments. Balance of payments. A former luminary in this field, which happens to be my field, Jacques Rueff, wrote a book called Le lancinant problème de la balance des paiements. And it was translated into English as balance of payments. So the point about being poignant is not there. Why? Because, of course, in the US, you make fun of the balance of payments. And on that, I have to rush. Okay, very, very quick factoids about can we live with floating exchange rates? Some research I've done with Urho Lempinen, a Finnish colleague, suggests that we can. I mean, they are all in the paper. So the problem here is really whether you could undo the Eurozone in an orderly fashion. I don't think it's possible, but the problem is not that exchange rate risk is all of that bad. So you can solve balance of payments problems with flexible exchange rates or with fixed exchange rates. It's a different problem, a completely different problem, but both are possible if, again, you have a solution, and being a small country, you take the constraints that are there upon you. I'm going to have to really rush through this. Notice that the volatilities of the euro-US dollar rate are around 10%, much less than those of stocks or bonds. And of course, if there were commodities, it would be even stronger. And well, there was one point that was mentioned at lunch that I could refer to. It's called Juncker's curse. These are the 2 prime ministers that survived since that famous OECD meeting, with the difference that Juncker is on his way out, so he will probably not be there next time around. But he has a saying that has become very influential in Europe and was checked by Marco Butti of the European Commission, which is that we know what reforms to do, especially in good times, but we don't know how to win elections after that. And so this Juncker curse is something that actually is not right if financial markets work correctly, because then they reward reforms that are there before the crisis. And of course, after the global crisis, we cannot say that financial markets are working well, if they ever did. I had a graph here. But this is a graph about the debt, again, from work with this colleague, and it shows that the debt, including public and private debt, is much, much larger than what is generally seen, over 200% of GDP for Japan, Cyprus, US, Greece. But complementary reforms and the reforms under the pressure of the financial markets are really very bad see. So again, as I told you, sorry about the swimmer, just wanted to give you a point here from Reinhard Rogoff. Again, it was quoted this morning. I only arranged the dates, but what is interesting here about Portugal is that from 1300, that's when the story begins, until the Napoleonic invasions, there was one default. In Germany, Prussia at the time, there were 3, and the only one that had none were the Netherlands. But then after that, there was an enormous amount of defaults, and in the last one was in 1890. So again, in terms of the conscience that the balance of payments is a guarantee of your monetary independence, Portugal has a tradition that was abandoned. and we had successive defaults in the 19th century. The other point I want to make about Portugal, there you see the tragic decline and the divergence in the 20th century. It's very clear. But now you see here a point that was made in a World Bank report. Imagine that the countries in the southern periphery of Europe, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, whose level of labor productivity is listed there, so Portugal is by far the lowest, would have been similar to the accessing countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Well, then the gap would have been minus 2% in Greece, minus 0.5 and 0.6% in Spain and Italy, respectively, and only minus 0.1% in Portugal. So this shows that there is a regional problem of productivity in those countries, but again, that there are very sizable differences between them. And I had a list of reforms. This has to do with existence of fiscal rules, of which there are none in Portugal compared to Sweden and the UK, some message of hope from industrial productivity, and what am I going to do as a conclusion? What about the beach? What about the beach that we are all looking forward to? Well, here it is. I come back to the balance of payments, and I had this quote about John Connolly. I happened to actually watch it at the time. This was my first foray into the IMF meetings. The dollar is our currency, but your problem. I don't think it's apocryphal. I actually heard the guy say that with his genuine Texan accent. Well, I mean, in the case of the European Union, I mean, sometimes it is seen that the euro is our currency, but it's our problem as well, certainly of the periphery, because we have no way of changing the rules of the game. And this is, of course, the reason why, in some respects, I think the world crisis now may lead the European Union to change its way of interacting with the rest of the world and with the United States as well. There are a bunch of questions involving the so-called Yale School imperfect asset substitution, asset substitution between the euro-denominated and dollar-denominated assets, but I certainly don't have time to go through that. Okay, the last point is about what I read in the FT a few days ago coming here. The hedge funds miss the sheer force of political will behind the project. So the idea now that there is a lull is not just as flickery markets are thinking. I mean, in Portugal, we know, for example, that there is a reinvestment in due to the proximate exit from the program, and this is happening throughout the periphery. So that's clear that there is a hope. But then, is the Eurozone certain to be saved? There, I believe no. Not sure. We are not sure. I will, in the question, if I have any questions, I will try to address that point. But that Portugal will make it to that beach, whether it exists or whether it's just a figment of the swimmer's imagination, I believe it will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much on your emphasis on the balance of payments crisis. I think it's very important to continue with that in the coming elaborations. But first of all, we're going to a country without a balance of payments constraint because it has a flexible exchange rate. Unfortunately, it's nevertheless in trouble. So there can be something else, but a balance of payments crisis. But Stuart Holland will tell us about it.
I have one figure. Can somebody help me find it?
Oh.
I will provide some technical assistance to my oldest ally, because I learned how to do this.
Well done.
Well, one more. You have one, or you?
Trajectory, it's supposed to be called.
Trajectory. I promise I didn't hide it. It's not here.
Very kind woman.
Draft resolution of the European Parliament.
No.
That should do it.
No, that's not it. Yeah, I mean, I did write that one, but...
Sorry, I don't want to get in the way, okay? You just fend for yourself, okay?
Can you nevertheless try to start?
I would like to get the figure.
Someone can try to help. Why don't you get started? You need it right at the beginning.
No, I don't need it at the beginning, but...
Is it in Word? What is it in?
I don't know. It's. I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
Okay, let's get that out of there. Is it
Trajectory, that's it.
Trajectory.
Well done.
just had
Yeah.
that? So it's either this or...
Oh, and it's reconciling stability with growth. Yeah, well done. Okay.
Hang on, let's...
We see it, yes, just about.
Wait, we'll get there.
Okay.
Oh, we can't see the bottom of it. Well, that'll do. No, the bottom is just words. Fine. Thank you very much. Peripheries. I could say a lot about centers and peripheries. It's where I started my research on regional development in the Mezzogiorno. And it was quite evident since Italian integration in 1861 that the North was going to outpace the South. The only time that that was qualified was following legislation in 1957, which obliged state enterprise to locate 40% of its total investment and 60% of investment in new plant in the South. There was no manufacturing there. There still is very little manufacturing there. And what surprises me about Olli Rehn and Wolfgang Schäuble is they don't seem to recognize that these are the internal dynamics of a capitalist market system. You can't get balanced growth simply by the free working of the market. And the freer the working of the market is, the more you aggravate disparities between regions. This was well analyzed by Gunnar Myrdal, by François Pérou, and others. Wolfgang Schäuble wrote an article, maybe it was published in different languages, but it was published in The Guardian a few weeks ago. And he says how much he regrets that the German question is back, die Deutsche Frage. Because Germany doesn't want hegemony, he says. All he wants is other member states to compete. But they can't compete with Germany. It's just not possible. And the one word he didn't mention in the article was cohesion. Because since the first revision of the Rome Treaty and the Single European Act of 1986, the then community and now union is supposed to be committed to both an internal market and to economic and social cohesion. Economic and social cohesion was the basis of the Rome Treaty in the first place. Let's put on one side the famous words of Robert Schuman on the creation of the coal and steel community, that another war between France and Germany would not only be morally unthinkable, but materially impossible. Put that on one side, cohesion was the essence of the Rome Treaty, in as much as the common agricultural policy, which is the only one that they committed to seriously at that time, was a means for Germany to pay reparations to France for the war without it being said. And that cohesion principle was very important, for example, with the revaluation of on the question of whether or not the Deutschmark should be revalued. And I'm going to touch briefly on the statutes of the European Investment Bank, the treaty commitment on the European Investment Bank, Central Bank, because this echoes the constitution of the Bundesbank, which was not only to protect the internal and external stability of the currency, but also to support the general economic policies of the federal government. Not the Federal Republic, how could you define that, but the federal government. And this was how various decisions were taken. For example, France, the Deutschmark was so undervalued that France and Italy were very, very concerned about their loss of competitiveness. And so they formed an inner economic council, no treaty provision for it, to pressure for the revaluation of the Deutschmark. And of course, the Bundesbank was totally opposed. But it happened. And these kinds of internal changes don't depend necessarily on treaty provisions. What we risk is competing ourselves to death. Just reducing wage costs, social benefits, etc., not only will not bring a recovery, but it will destroy any aspiration to a European social model and cohesion. So, Europe initially was the cradle of democracy. The way we're going now, it risks becoming its grave. I want to talk in relation to this figure, which relates also to the case which Yanis and James and I have been making in the recent modest proposal, but also relates to centers and peripheries. Now, the proposal, the orders of magnitude change, but what the case is based on is a recommendation that I made to Jacques Delors in 1993 that the Union should issue its own bonds, and that these, like US Treasury bonds, should not count on national debt. US Treasury bonds don't count on the national debt, to put it that way, of California, Delaware, or Texas. Now, I recommended this be by a European investment fund. He got the fund set up, and its terms of reference allow it to issue bonds. But what happened then was a very senior director of the European Investment Bank rang me up in London and said, Stuart, we've seen your paper to the president, and we've seen his white paper of December 93, recommending the Union issue bonds. We see in your paper that you made the analogy with the US and that the borrowing need not count on national debt. The issue was not you would need a fiscal union, because you don't. If you issue bonds and they are for investment projects, the revenues from the investment projects pay for servicing the bonds. But he said, of course the President of the Commission can have any new financial institution he likes, provided he can persuade the European Council. But maybe he and maybe you have not realized that of the present member states, that was 12, only 2 count borrowing from us against national debt. Well, I didn't know. Delors didn't know. I mean, this was like finding gold under the Rhine. It was potential liberation. But the reality is, and again, not a treaty provision, an in-house working rule of the European Investment Bank, is that it only co-finances up to 50% of an investment. That's quite sensible. You want your other partner, under normal circumstances, to make a commitment. But the bank was doing its own thing, which, like the World Bank, tended to be large-scale infrastructure projects. And I argued with Antonio Guterres, who was then Prime Minister of Portugal, that the bank should be given a social investment remit to invest in health, education, urban regeneration, the environment, and at Lisbon in 2000, we got that extended also to new high-tech startups and green technology. From 1997 until 2007-8, this widened social investment remit, with the social investments not counting on national debt, meant that the European Investment Bank quadrupled its investments, up to over 82 billion, which begins to be a big figure, especially if you take into account that investment multipliers are significantly higher than fiscal multipliers. They're up to 3. Now, when the Eurozone crisis hit, and the financial crisis, following the financial crisis, EIB partner member states could not easily fund projects. And the result was that its lending fell within 3 years from 82 billions to 45 billions, which is virtually halved. So I hadn't quite forgotten about the European Investment Fund, but it's potentially come into its own. Its remit was to issue equity venture capital. That was the design remit. It didn't do it. Under various pressures, especially from DG Economy and Finance, its role was guarantees for small and medium firms. And that was pathetic, because from the time it was set up until the creation of the euro, it had only guaranteed 1 billion ECU, which is nothing. To take the macro point and then come to the micro point, and then I'll finish. The macro scale, the potential scale of joint EIB-EIF bond issues, they are now part of the same group since 2000, is really very considerable in terms of recycling global surpluses, because there are trillions of uninvested surpluses in the world economy. And although rating agencies are readily blamed, it wasn't, the Eurozone crisis was not directly their fault. I think you'll be familiar with almost synchronous interest rates on bonds until it became plain that, putting it simply, Germany was not going to bail out Greece. When it became apparent that there was no solidarity, no cohesion, such as there had been earlier, then the rating agencies targeted the weaker member states. This would not be the case if there were, and it is an important macro distinction, between debt mutualization, which is very difficult. It's possible. It's very possible in the way that Germany resolved her own internal crisis between East and West, because they put the Eastern German debt in a debit account. They put it in, it was called a Blastentilgungsfond, a redemption fund. And they simply gradually paid it off, which is behind the Bruegel blue bond, red bond proposal, and also the proposal to write off debt above 60% of GDP, which is the German Council of Economic Advisors. The effect on recovery is, instead of waiting for the recovery of market confidence, do what was done by the originator of the OECD, and I'm not going to get into dating exercises, but the OECD was an extension of the OEEC, which allocated Marshall aid. And it was Robert Marjolin, and the US was fantastic at that time. Instead of doing the kind of deal now, you must have stability, you mustn't have deficits of more than 3%, Marjolin simply asked countries for a development plan. How many minutes have I got? Three, yes. Asked for a development plan. Now, Italy sent one in, and he sent it back. He said, I want a development plan for Italy. I don't want a shopping list for reconstruction. But otherwise, Italy was free to decide itself how it would use the Marshall aid. On the question of, so what you've got here is not Keynesian demand pull. You've got a case for investment supply push. Keynes was not against investment projects, but in the general theory, he only talked about indirect demand management through fiscal and monetary policy, taxes and interest rates. And that just gives, he also said, if you're in a recession or depression, lowering interest rates is as effective as pushing on a piece of string. So we really need to get back to the Marshall aid and US New Deal type philosophy of not waiting for a recovery of private confidence and not being terrified by bond markets. Because it's overlooked that in January last year, Standard & Poor's stressed in a statement that Europe needed growth, not simply austerity. And that without growth, there would be no recovery. Bond markets are not going to be terrified by a recovery program. Bill Gross of PIMCO, one of the biggest bond investors in the world, has recently, in July, made the same point. You've got to get recovery. Austerity is not going to do it. A simple thing on small and medium firms, periphery, my last point, and the original recommendation that the European Investment Fund should have an equity capital capacity. Because equity capital, Germany may not think it's a problem, but for example, equity capital in Italy, venture capital markets, is 1/6 that of Germany. Germany's equity capital is 1/6 that of the United States. I mean, there are many, many firms are now facing real refinancing problems because the European Investment Bank, the European Central Bank is lending money to other central banks at 1%, and they're on lending to small and medium firms at 7, 8 or more %. I had a meeting, a rather high-level meeting at the European Central Bank. I'm not supposed to say with whom. Though it wasn't Mario Draghi. Though otherwise, there might not have been a high-level meeting. Yes, I'm coming. I said, why don't you make, your lending to governments is conditional. Why don't you make your lending to banks conditional? And he said it was ruled out. It's not actually ruled out. Because the European Council, the European Central Bank is obliged to support the general economic policies of the Union. And that includes the provision that the European Council could define that such a policy was on lending at low interest rates by banks who are beneficiaries of funding from the ECB. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being timely. You said others can't compete with Germany. I hope we're hearing about an example that I hesitate to call example from the periphery, about Italy. And Italy in the past could compete with Germany. Now it can no longer. And the question is why. But maybe that's one of the things you will approach. Mr. Ricceri, please.
The first, I thank you to be here, to be invited here, Professor Galbraith and other colleagues that organized this event. It's an honor for me. When you ask to the point of view of Italy, it's, I can say there is a great disorientation about the future of Europe. Many contrasting elements are on our head and on the population, so it's quite difficult. We are making a lot of in-depth economic, social analysis, and it's difficult to find a positive solution. My remarks are constructive, but I have to admit some elements that I show you now. First thing, we have to take in our mind that what we live in Europe as in the States is a structural crisis. And the structural crisis, we know how to enter, but we don't know how to get out. In any case, we are sure that structural crises change completely the balance in a society, the style of life of the people, the perspective of life, etc. So now we are in this situation. We are living a structural crisis. That means also that a structural crisis, as the historian can give great support to us, the structural crisis have floating in the sense they are financial, then economic, then social, then political, institutional, and so on. And now we see we adjust the finance, but we have the social problem and the political problem, and all this shall have a great influence on the future of Europe. Alors, the first thing is during the lunchtime came out two important elements that we must put in consideration, in our consideration. The Dean, introducing the Belgian ministers, say that there is this idea of two speedy Europes. I want to come back on this point because it's linked to the perspective. Second, the ministers say there are political elements that we have to take in consideration. And in fact, if we don't take in consideration even the political elements, we don't understand what is the real condition of the Eurozone and the possibility to design a good solution for it. And the Greek representative this morning said a very interesting thing. The situation of the budget in Greece was in the 80s was well known by the European Commission, but they accepted the entrance in the European Union because of political reason, because there was the finish of the dictatorship and the beginning of democracy. So they accepted the entrance of Greece, even if the budget situation was that he has described. So the political reason was more strong than the economic reasons. But the same euro is born only for political reasons, because the collapse of the Soviet Union and the unification of Germany, and the people were had feared that united Germany in Europe with a strong money was be a risk for everybody. So the argument was between Mitterrand and Kohl, we accept the unification of Germany, but you renounce to your money, to the Deutsche Mark. So the euro is born for political reason, not for economic reason. In fact, the first projects to have a common money in Europe were in the 62 report Malin. There was the first project was in 62, so it took more than 30 years, 40 years to have a money. And the money, the euro money, came only for political reasons, not for economic reasons. So these are the elements we have to take in mind. Allora, looking at the situation of Eurozone, the first thing, in my view, no time, it's to fight in the rhetoric, the mythological vision of Europe, and to be more realistic. What I suppose with the rhetoric, there is the continuous remarks of many responsible. We shall have the possibility to exit, to overcome our crisis, building a more political Europe, building the United States of Europe. Yesterday, on an Italian paper, our premier, that is very clever man, he said, oh, the solution is the United States of Europe. What means this is a nonsense. Why I say nonsense? Because, and I take the remarks from the former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, he said, we did a big mistake. We did, in the same time, the enlargement of Europe and the building of euro. The two things are in contrast. This is the real weakest point of the Eurozone. Why? And he suggests to be realistic, to recover he define European rationality. So to put the feet on the border, otherwise we don't find a solution. When we say the exit is to build a political Europe, to build the United States of Europe, we must take into account that there is the problem of reducing the national sovereignty of the states. This is the real obstacle. The question is, in what dimension, in what terms the new coming states inside Europe are in the condition to renounce to their national sovereignty, to give up a part of this national sovereignty. This is a big problem for France. This is a big problem for UK. But take in consideration that the new state, the new member states, are independent, the most of them are independent only since 20 years. Slovakia was independent in its life only 18 days. Poland was divided and BC sovereignty for a century. Czech Republic, Croatia, all the Baltic states are independent only since 20 years, 18, 20 years. So can you imagine how they defend their national sovereignty? And what is the limit they cannot overcome to renounce for an imprecise political union? So this is the real problem when we consider the situation of Eurozone and the possibility to go on in the integration process. What is the answer we see on the table? For this, our doubts. We see that while the political Europe remain a very unclear, imprecise project, in real terms, there is a strong advancement of the role of the technocrats. This is the fact. So we are building the Europe of technocrats. In this sense, I can say that we have no doubt that the Eurozone in the hand of technocrats will survive. But while giving this role to the technocrats, we see that the cohesion process is collapsing. The cohesion means the Europe into speed, the many proposals done by Rampuy, done by the same Delors. Let's create two Eurozone. Let's create one for the North and one for the South. Let's create two euro, two money, one for the North, one for the South. So while they are going to save Eurozone, they are destroying the cohesion of the system. And this is the real danger for the future Europe. One final remark, and then I finish. The real doubt of the people is the lack of the coherence between what is written in the treaties and what is the concrete experience we are doing. In the treaty, we, in Europe, we say clearly that the European system is a economic, social market economy, with all implications of this. And this was written to distinguish the European model to the United States model. Allora, what is social is completely disappeared. Europe is full of inequalities in all levels, among the states, among the people, among the social groups. It's is going in the direction of multi-speed, not two-speed, multi-speed. And so you shall have at the end the Eurozone saved because they are banks and eurocrats, but the people is going to other direction, and you shall destroy the dream and the possibility of the European Union as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now come to a view from Poland, I'm not sure, but with a Polish perspective at least, overlooking Europe, Jan Toporowski.
Thank you very much. Thank you in particular to Jamie and for Yanis for their energy and inspiration in organizing this at actually such a very, very high level. I'm not talking about myself, at a very, very high level in such a short period of time, and with such excellent contributions. I'm talking about the contributions that have preceded me. For myself, I feel I should add to the little biography that I put in the book that I'm in fact a failed banker. But I hasten to add that it wasn't my bank that failed, it was my career as a banker that failed. But it does actually, I say this because it does affect the way the view that I have on economic issues and in particular on the issue of the euro and the way in which the euro works. First of all, on this, let me say that the usual way in which we think of GDP or national income is just something that's produced. I actually think of it as being a relationship between debt stocks. And if you take, let's say, private sector debt and government sector debt, there is a certain relationship between them. If you try to reduce the government sector debt and the private sector debt expands correspondingly, then there's actually nothing happens with GDP. However, if you try to reduce government debt without an expansion of private sector debt, then what you get is actually a catastrophic fall in GDP. And this is the kind of debt dynamics that we've been observing in Southern Europe. It's in this kind of context that one can see the loose monetary policies of for example, the Bank of England in the country where I come from, in Great Britain, or the Federal Reserve. What they're actually doing is the loose monetary policies, in fact, don't have much effect on private sector investment, business investment. What they do is, in economies where there's a property-owning middle class, is they actually stimulate household indebtedness, and in this way, a revival of the asset inflation that in the US and the UK was supported the previous rather modest boom before the crisis came. This, of course, doesn't work in Europe. I mean, there are large middle classes, but they don't operate debt in this way. So that's one point. That's my banker's view. With my other hat as an economist, I want to reinforce the point that's previously been made by Heiner, Flassbeck, by Erna Schroeder this morning, that a reduction in wages is not a way out of the crisis. Because what happens with reduction in wages is that any export competitiveness that's obtained is obtained at the cost of the domestic market, so that the net effect on output and employment is negligible. And you can see this in the case of Germany. Germany, which had 15 years ago, after unification, had a roughly balanced foreign trade, is now much more orientated towards exports, has an export, a substantial export surplus, or significant export surplus, but the domestic market has stagnated. And of course, if you do this on a multilateral level, a number of countries do this, then you end up with you actually end up with global deflation. You don't get much of an export benefit. And of course, this is where the Deus ex machina of China is so beneficial, because as long as China keeps stimulating investment, we can all pretend that lowering wages does gain you export competitiveness in the long run. I think from this comes the intractability of the crisis. You see, when a thinking person messes up, what they do is they think, well, you know, why didn't this work? You know, why am I in a mess? The unthinking person reinforces their efforts in doing what created the mess. And this, I'm afraid, is what's happening in the Eurozone, or in Europe as a whole, and it's what's reinforcing the deflation. The key victims of this are the young, because of the way the labour market works, and the young and the unskilled. And I guess if there's one source of kind of positive thing in this very sad outlook, it is the fact that the young are not buying into the xenophobia that the older people are. I mean, when we look at the anti-European party in the UK, UKIP, that's the standard supporter of UKIP is unskilled, male, unemployed, or recently retired, who over the age of 50. That's where the xenophobia is. Okay, let me move on to the periphery, since this is really what the session is about. I think the periphery has to be seen in this kind of context, and it raises the fundamental financial reason why the euro needs to continue, why it must continue. There's a paradox about the periphery, that all the time that the situation within the Eurozone is going from bad to worse, all the time while the the leaders of the European Union are engaging in what used to be called in Poland under communism the propaganda sukcesu, the propaganda of success. Particularly now, you know, the situation, the downturn has leveled off. So what do? You hail success. Despite the fact that unemployment is still rising, especially among the young, you hail success and you say, at no cost must we turn away from these measures, which are now finally bearing fruit. And you say, well, what consolation is this to the 40% of young people who are unemployed? That, you know, that when's something going to be done for them? Oh, well, no, the answer for them must be these structural reforms. They must accept much lower wages, much lower social protection. It's this, I think, which is feeding and will feed what, for me, will be a most welcome revolt of the young. In the when it comes, of course, where I work at SOAS, there's a permanent revolt of the young. The paradox of countries coming into the euro. The reason for coming into the euro, the reason why all these countries are queuing up to go into the euro, is because of the financial, the innovations that have occurred in the financing operations, the open market operations of the ECB since the last conference here in 2011. What's actually happened is that not that the ECB under Mario Draghi has taken responsibility for government indebtedness. Far from it. They have taken responsibility for the state of the banking system, with the realization that, you know, forget about inflation or anything else, the most shameful, the most embarrassing thing that can happen to a central banker on a central banker's watch is if the financial system collapses on them. This is why, in fact, when the last our previous governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, left, he was the murmurings in the corridors were, yes, but look what he did in 2007. You know, the mess of Northern Rock. Okay, what can we? It's this ability of the ECB to support banking systems in a way which countries on the periphery that are in the exchange rate mechanism cannot support. That's the important factor. Why cannot they support them? Because of the effect of a financial integration in Europe. In a sense, for our North American friends, you have to cast your mind back to why was there a ban on interstate banking. The ban on interstate banking was so that the banking authorities in Delaware didn't have to take responsibility for problems that Delaware banks might have in California. And this is the this is the big problem. This is what makes the situation in Europe so different from the situation in Brazil, the situation in Argentina. This is not, those situations are not comparable. How do we get out? Clearly the way forward is, in my view, is higher wages. I believe Heiner Flassbeck to be very correct on this. In order to reflate the domestic market, fiscal policy needs to be maintained to keep those debt stocks stable, and what that needs to be supported by is much more active financial operations by the central bank, including operations along the yield curve, the type of thing which the Fed has been doing, but which the ECB has not done. So it's, and finally, private sector investment. This is the way out. I would just mention that at the last time I was here in 2011, I'll just mention in conclusion, I mentioned this idea of imposing a tax on balance sheets, in particular on the financial assets that are held in balance sheets that are registered, and using that tax to buy in the government debt. This is one way in which the governments can actually help to support their own debt markets, the long-term debt markets. If you do this, you can do this on a national basis. This can be done, in fact, without any change of the European treaties. There already exist institutions. Each country in Europe has a debt management office. And that's what they should do, manage the debt, not just sell bonds, but manage debts in this way. And in particular, a particular advantage of this is that in terms of stimulating private sector investment, this is a very good way of persuading big business, which, as Stuart mentioned, is sitting on, at the moment, on massive amounts of liquid assets. It's a way of getting them to start doing something with those liquid assets, start investing. This is the way to overcome the famous Keynesian liquidity preference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for being very disciplined with the time. I give the floor 5 minutes or so to the panelists to comment to the other ones, and then we open the floor for a couple of questions. We have a quarter of an hour left. So okay. Please, are there questions that you want to raise to your colleagues? Yeah.
Yes, actually I do. I was a little bit hoping that the UK special status within the European Union would be addressed by two of the speakers in the context of what would Europe be without the UK, because I think one of the problems is we have a very unstable architecture. A lot of the problems of the Eurozone are made worse by the fact that the UK, which has a very deep financial market, is not adding to the easy financial market, but at the same time also that what I think was a very successful process of enlargement, bringing in countries from Eastern Europe, is also left a little bit without knowing. We think that Poland might be taking the place of the UK, but I mean there are doubts. So my question is, will the UK be saved? You know, from Europe, will it leave? And would that be a good thing or a bad thing? I think at least the two that are nominally from the UK should shoot first. But I mean, that was one question that I didn't.
Okay.
I mean, Stuart, I think
I'm
you
worried
should say
about
something.
it.
I'm happy to comment.
I
on
want
the
reassurance.
financial
Maybe let's start with
aspects.
Stuart first and then Jan to follow.
Well, you know, without quoting Groucho Marx, who really wants to join this club? It's not putting on a very good show. And I used to have to share a Treasury bench with Gordon Brown, and we are not exactly soul mates, but I think one of the intelligent things he did was not go into the euro. And I made this case myself years and years ago. I wrote a book called Uncommon Market, which is about capital, class, and power in the Union. And I had a section which was called EMU, or ostrich. You know, I mean, if you go for monetary union without effective economic union, you're in difficulties. But also, I'm not a federalist. I should perhaps stress this in Texas. I'm a confederalist. I think that the hollowing out of national democracy is extremely dangerous. And that's what Giscard d'Estaing did with the European Constitution.
We're on agreement there.
Yeah, it was a disaster, absolute disaster. It was like an out-of-order telephone directory. I mean, even when it referred to some other article, very often in key issues, the article wasn't there. It had been so rushed through on a word processor. He should have brought, for example, Giuliano Amato made some excellent suggestions, and they were dismissed out of hand. One of them was for what we called enabling decision-making, so that if a majority of member states want to go ahead with a policy, they go ahead with it, but they don't impose it on the others. And in practice, I mean, this is Monnet's, in my view, Monnet's flawed design. You can stop me once I...
In a minute.
In a minute, okay. You know, everybody thinks, I mean, here's the great Jean Monnet. I mean, his design was profoundly undemocratic. And that was, you know, if you were looking back at the Third Republic in France, you might say, yes, well, democracy is a disaster as well. But the reason Monnet went to see Attlee and said, we're going to have a supranational community, there will be majority decision-making. He wasn't living in the real world. You can't say that to the Westminster Parliament. You can't, I mean, we just nationalized coal and we nationalized steel. Here comes along this technocrat.
I resist criticism of Monnet.
Okay.
No, I resist that.
But it's,
Well,
it's going
No,
too
he's
far.
a sacred
It's going
cow.
bit
Come on,
too
yeah.
far.
He's certainly a sacred cow.
No, don't criticize Monnet. Not on my watch. No.
But the result was Britain didn't join Europe then, and nor did the EFTA countries. And that was, in my view, a fatal mistake, just as supranationalism now.
Okay, something to be added from Jan?
I would just add that the problem of the UK, what makes the UK special I think from an economic point of view, is that the UK is in effect an international financial intermediary, a massive international financial intermediary, with all the social consequences that come from it, including industrial failure. I think something which will be possibly fairly familiar here, and this is why I'm very. I'm pro-European, but I think if I would not want Europe to become the type of industrial failure that Britain is.
Okay. So something to be added from Mr. Ricceri?
Just to ask your opinion about the use of fiscal policy that was mentioned during the lunchtime, because fiscal policy can be used in linkage with planning system to change, to drive the private and public consumption, and so to link the intervention of fiscal policy to the building of real social model. So, how to manage the balance between private consumption and public consumption that are unbalanced now. And so if the fiscal policy, it's a big, important tool in this direction. What is your opinion?
Jan Toporowski talked about it, but maybe not explicit enough. But
Which is the
balance you need, the balance between saving of the private sector and debt of the public sector, or the other way around. So
you need that, but nobody knows what fiscal policy means. It embraces so many different things. It's both taxation policy and it's public expenditure and it's public investment.
yeah, but we're mainly talking about public debt in the framework of the euro.
In particular, there is this the very sensible way in which, for example, traditionally the French approach to their fiscal policy was splitting up two budgets. You had a capital budget and you had a current budget, and it was the current budget that had to be balanced, but the capital budget, as long as you could finance it, this was fine, and I think this was a very good arrangement.
Okay, so the floor is open. Please, James first, then Norman Birnbaum. Then
I took the floor first.
Who took it?
Me.
Okay, I didn't see you, but...
No problem. The lady with the microphone did.
My fault, I pointed.
Very briefly.
Okay, go ahead.
Very
So
briefly.
we
I
have
will have
four
the-
speakers.
Yes, my name is Monica, and I will have the time tomorrow to answer this very passionate anti-federalist plea from Stuart, because I am of the opposite opinion. But my point would like to go on the title of this panel. I personally believe that it's really not appropriate to talk about periphery. And I would like to have your opinion about that.
I mentioned it several times, I think, as I'm not a fan of periphery and core also, but James may be responsible for that and ask a question at the same time.
Good.
Yeah, the mic is going, Yeah, okay, thank you.
I will not defend the phrase making for which I am in fact responsible.
See.
The major thrust of the various interventions has been toward, let's say, technical and economic policy aspects of this crisis and changes that could or should be made to stabilize the situation and reverse the direction that I think all of us see, at least at the social and political plane. I would like to ask the panelists, and including Heiner, if you would, to say a few words about the political dynamic that might be involved. Let us suppose that a major government of this region that we shall not now disparage by referring to it as the periphery, and certainly Italy is part of the core by any standard, should come to the view that the policies of Europe had to be changed. In other words, taking that first step toward a new direction. I guess my questions are, what specifically should it put forward first as a challenge and a request or negotiating position to its European partners? And secondly, what leverage would it have to achieve a kind of change of direction at some point in the general policy of the Eurozone?
Okay, thank you. We take all the questions at once. Now Norman Birnbaum is the next one, and then we go to the young man upstairs there, and then you.
Well, it's perhaps less of a question than an observation on the history of the extremely complex relationship of the United Kingdom to the European Union. Attlee certainly was a sturdy yeoman in rejecting Monet, that frivolous technocrat. On the other hand, the United Kingdom, beginning with the Labour government governments of 45, 51, had the most extraordinary dependence politically and economically on the United States, which conceivably an earlier entry into what was then the common market might conceivably have eased. Secondly, if I evoke the case of Scotland, it would appear that certain forms of federalism have insidiously crept in even to Her Majesty's realm. And thirdly, a bit of reminiscence. I was a fellow of Nuffield College in the late 50s and early 60s when our political fellows who came up one day a week were Ted Heath, then a minister in the government, negotiating Britain's entry into what was the common market, and Jim Callaghan representing the opposition. And what was very interesting was Heath's continuous complaints that the French civil servants in Brussels were running rings around his Oxford, Cambridge
Spot on. Yes.
persons. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We pass it on upstairs on the left first and then to the right.
Hello. Stuart, you started your talk talking about northern Italy and basically trying to bring southern Italy up to par, and how that really has not worked out well, and it's hard to do. But thinking about German unification, most of the industry was in the North Rhine region of Germany. Yeah. And Bavaria was actually a poor, more agrarian country, region. After they got rid of King Ludwig, and you used the term compete yourself to death. Maybe not compete yourself to death, but maybe a little bit more competition in Europe, like they've used in Bavaria to move themselves up from one of the just agrarian provinces of Germany to, I think it's now the wealthiest province in Germany.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
No.
Can we pass it?
I will answer.
No,
let's I will answer. I'm allowed to, but may I just say, I can't see you from here, so I don't want to walk straight past you after this session.
Okay.
So introduce yourself.
Okay. Please, Jay Pocklington.
Thank you. I would like to. I like this slant towards the politics, the political reality that we're facing in this crisis, and would like to get your opinion on the political equilibrium, if you will, in Germany that is also reinforced by the public perception of the crisis. If we take a look at the fruits that the German population sees from the crisis and sort of the stability that sort of Merkel does indeed represent for the Germans, I would like to sort of get your opinion on the following, if you will. Germany is not moving because it's in a comfortable spot, right? Germany is benefiting from low interest rates from the ECB. It's benefiting from the euro being relatively undervalued for them, for their exports to China and outside of Europe, and in general, the business environment, also labor is migrating. All the skilled labor is migrating from the, if you allow me, from the periphery to the center. Okay. This is reinforcing. So we're reaping benefits in Germany from the circumstance, and we've seen earlier that the growth in Germany is not that much higher. It's not that great, even though these overwhelming circumstances favoring German growth or. But the fact is that these circumstances make a very comfortable environment for the German politicians not to make a drastic move. And I wonder what exactly could get German politicians to change this political equilibrium that they're facing.
It's very much going along the lines what James was asking. So I give everyone 60 seconds, including myself, because I was addressed. So let's start with Jan Toporowski and then go from left to right from my point of view.
It's really is a periphery appropriate term to use. In some respects it is, as long as it's borne in mind that, in fact, every country has its own periphery, including Germany, which has within its borders its own periphery, which is former East Germany. And what does this reveal? It reveals, I think, a very fundamental point, and that is that fiscal federalism is not enough. There has to be more done. In terms of the priority for Europe or for the European Commission, I think it's very simple. The priority for the European Commission has to be to organize economic recovery. This should be the priority. There are other questions which I'm sorry if I haven't been able to answer, but I can
maybe
answer
they cover by others. So, Ricceri.
periphery for me is very clear concept. It's the weaker side of society, weaker side of Europe. So it's very clear in this sense. Alors, for Europe, the key point, we can continue for 1 or 2 years to talk about the bank union, how to save the bank equilibrium, etc. But if we don't work on a social contract, general social contract of Europe, you save the bank, but you miss the people. This is the fact. You miss the people. It's not my remark. It's a remark of a couple of commissioners that pass from Rome that say, we shall have a disaster to the next election, and we have missed the people. So signing a social contract means to be coherent with what is written in the Lisbon Treaty. Social market economy, full employment, social cohesion, and social dialogue. If we go deeply to the social dialogue, just finished, we see that all the debate now it's on the government of Europe. That means more power to the Commission, more power to the Parliament. So this is government. There is no one effort to organize a governance. That means to give responsibility, a role to the civil society organization at all.
Okay. Thank you very much. Stuart.
If you forgive me, well, I think you'll be glad. I'm only going to answer one question. But that's on the British, Britain and Europe and the British application. I was involved in this. I arrived in our cabinet office in January 1966 and found a top secret paper slammed on my desk from the Foreign Office. It was pathetic. As a master's thesis, I'd give it Delta minus. At the end of that month, you had the Luxembourg veto. And they wrote another memorandum saying, de Gaulle can't decide whether he's Jeanne d'Arc or Louis XIV, and until he dies, there's no way we're going to get in. I devised 3-4 arguments for how to get in, and one was to accept the Luxembourg veto. And then it would have been part of the Treaty of Accession. Another was a European technology community. There was, France and the UK especially had wonderful technology and not enough funding. We should have had joint funding, and Europe should have had an industrial and technology policy. Then mutual currency support, which the Foreign Office hadn't thought of, for the franc zone and the sterling zone. I'm just going to end at this point. I got through to de Gaulle. And afterwards, Wilson brought me into 10 Downing Street. I resigned from 10 Downing Street because he didn't follow through. He knew that de Gaulle said yes to these conditions, but he said, and he also said, I negotiated through his interior minister, Louis Jacques. Jacques said, you must openly abandon the special relationship. And I said, it's not needed. I actually said, in politics, as in love, abandoning a given relationship for a very uncertain other is not a very good idea. But what they said then, Jacques said, il faut de Gaulle, the following, he went straight to see de Gaulle with the case. I expected nothing more than, well, that's very interesting, Mr. Holland. We shall, of course, inform the president. And the following morning, de Gaulle said yes, and he avoided the special relationship issue. The only thing that we had to do by a bilateral protocol was préciser les projets. We had to make the joint technology project specific. And Wilson knew that was a condition, therefore he failed to do it, therefore he appeased the right of the Labour Party by applying, and he appeased the left by failing. And these are among the reasons why I quit number 10.
Thank you very much. So, Macedo.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the concept of periphery is meaningless. It's a relative concept. Periphery relative to what? Within Europe, of course, France is also in the periphery. And in many ways, Europe itself is in the periphery of the world, as I mentioned tirelessly since this morning. And one of the great problems at the moment is that the engine of European construction is one country that has its periphery, for sure, Germany, but has another one that used to give the will to advance, even this case of General proves the point, and is frozen between fear of the street and fear of being dominated by Germany. So periphery is meaningless. Political dynamic, Jamie's question. By the way, thanks, Jamie, for having me here.
Okay, we don't have time
the
for that.
problem, no, we do, because it's related to the political dynamic in Portugal. As I said, the three major parties hate the memorandum, but they feel that the only thing they can do under the circumstances is carry it out. And this is a problem because the two parties that are outside of the memorandum, one is extremely traditionalist, that's the Communist Party. It has grown in the last elections, but the one that is more, quote, cultured, which is the leftist bloc, is nowhere. So the political dynamic is a problem. Everybody is unsatisfied, but nobody can find a way out. This is at least the case of Portugal, to my best knowledge.
We're talking about a similar case in a minute when we talk about Greece. Just my very quick answer.
But Portugal is not Greece. Okay.
No. But the periphery. The point is the periphery doesn't have a negotiating position, a strong negotiating position. So if you want to change things, you have to sit down with Germany and challenge its view on economic policy. That's what it's all about. But who can do that? Greece cannot do it. Portugal cannot do it alone. But if a critical mass, say Italy and France and some other countries join and sit not only at a table, but put a weapon on the table, that's the only thing, and a very sharp weapon on the table, then Germany will move. And the weapon is exit. The weapon is exit and devaluation. That's the only weapon that's around. And if you're not willing to do that, then you go on for the next 100 years until your democracy is broken. Thank you.
Brilliant.